I began this video series with the claim that the West is dying. But what do I mean by the West? In spite of what the name might suggest, the West is not a particular piece of geography, nor any specific ethnic group or language, none of that. What makes the West distinct is an idea, a unique approach to life and the universe, which is open to all human beings, wherever they happen to find themselves. You want to know what it is I'm talking about? Stick around. Last time I tried to demonstrate the futility of indiscriminately embracing all philosophy as good or rejecting all of it as useless. Instead, we need to learn how to discriminate between good and bad philosophy, just like we should and must discriminate between 1,000 other good and bad things in life. Which raises the question, by what standard can we judge a philosophy as good or bad, right or wrong? And the answer lies at the birthplace of Western civilization. The year is 585 BC, the place is the ancient Greek city of Miletus, and the man is Thales. Thales is widely regarded as the father of philosophy, and as we will see, with ample justification. Thales is the first man in recorded history who looked out at the world and explicitly asked, "What is it?" Now, to understand the groundbreaking importance of his achievement, we need to consider the historic context in which Thales came up with this question. For all the centuries and millennia prior to Thales, men were stuck with a very different kind of question when they were looking out at the world. The only question they kept asking is, who is it? For example, when the ancient Egyptians encountered the river Nile, they asked, who is it? And they came up with the answer, Anuket, goddess of the river. When they looked up towards the sun, they asked, who is it? And they came up with the answer, Ra, god of the sun. Now I'm sure you know that all prehistoric and primitive societies share this way of looking out at the world and coming up with all sorts of different gods, spirits, and demons as explanatory agents. And the reason why they always kept asking this question and not the one posed by Thales is not too difficult to grasp. A prehistoric man, like any other, needs some form of philosophy, at least implicitly. He has to acquire some kind of understanding of the world if he wants to survive in it. And what he understands best is what he experiences firsthand on a daily basis. He can observe himself and his kin move around and act to pursue specific goals. They create tools, weapons, clothing and shelter. They hunt and kill. They reproduce and die. By means of introspection, he can also directly observe the causal agent responsible for doing all these things, namely a consciousness. So when he encounters some entity or phenomena in the world, he will try to explain it in terms of what he knows best, namely as a purposefully acting entity, like himself, or as a creation produced at the hands of another consciousness. This way of explaining things in this world is not only the one closest to home, but it also has some valid and valuable applications, namely when applied to other men and animals. As a result, this view became extremely pervasive, and of course still is to this day. On the other hand, the notion that something could exist in a completely different way, without itself having a consciousness, or without being the product of a consciousness operating behind the scenes, remained utterly inconceivable for tens of thousands of years. It took an epic genius to grasp the idea that the most basic ingredient making up reality is not who, but what. Not consciousness, but existence. Thus we have arrived at the answer to what is distinctive to the West, and what distinguishes good from bad philosophy. The idea that consciousness, be it one or many, represents the fundamental unit of reality, and the universe is simply a creation or byproduct of consciousness, is called the primacy of consciousness. The idea that existence comes first and consciousness can only exist as part of existence is called the primacy of existence. And Thales is the first representative of the primacy of existence view. As an aside, let me also mention that this distinction between the primacy of consciousness and the primacy of existence is much wider than the distinction between atheism and theism. As we will come to see at a later stage, it is quite possible to be an atheist and advocate for the primacy of consciousness, or to believe in some form of the supernatural while operating on a primacy of existence premise. So the primacy of consciousness versus existence is much more fundamental. In fact, it is so fundamental that we can chart the entire history of philosophy along this spectrum. But that's looking ahead. For now, let's get back to Thales' question. Thales' attempt to inquire into the basic nature of the universe without defaulting to some consciousness as an explanation gave rise to the first and most fundamental branch of philosophy, called Metaphysics. And it involves precisely the sort of questions that we've looked at. Namely, what is reality? Is it made of existence or of consciousness, or of both? If it's made of both, then does consciousness exist as a part of existence, or does existence come about as a creation of consciousness? Of course, Thales wasn't primarily concerned with raising the question of metaphysics, but with answering it. And his answer to the question, what is it, was, everything is water. As far as we can conjecture, he based this view on simple common sense observations. Water is something he could observe as a gas, liquid, and solid. Water is something all living things need to exist, and it can be found in the earth, oceans, and in the sky. So he thought the one ingredient that all things in the universe have in common must be water. Of course, today we know he got the answer wrong, but from his context of knowledge it was a perfectly sensible hypothesis. And as I indicated, the importance of Thales lies not with his specific answer, but with his question. A question which puts all men who value reason and science in his debt. Thales' groundbreaking achievement led to the first ever flourishing of philosophic thought in human history. New thinkers from all over the Greek world emerged who were eager to discuss the new science of metaphysics and provide their own answers to Thales' question. These philosophers are known as the Pre-Socratics, because they all flourished during the time before Socrates came on the scene. I'll restrict myself to a quick run-through of the most important Pre-Socratics, whose answers on the subject of metaphysics had enduring influence. Let's start with Pythagoras. Pythagoras and his followers, the Pythagoreans, were obsessed with mathematics. Consequently, they came up with the answer that everything is numbers. Everything is numbers. Next is Heraclitus. Heraclitus said, everything is change. Nothing is, everything is becoming. So the existence of entities on his view is really an illusion, because everything is in constant flux. Then we have Parmenides, who strongly disagreed with Heraclitus. And he came up with the notion that change is an illusion, because everything is ultimately one. Then we have Empedocles, who held that everything is made of earth, air, water, fire, and sometimes ether is added as a fifth element. This view, as I'm sure you know, became the first philosophic basis for physics and dominated the field for 2000 years, until the Renaissance. The last pre-Socratic I want to introduce is Democritus, who was the most prominent of the ancient atomists. And they held that everything is atoms, which are the tiniest of particles and which move through empty space. So much for a quick run-through of the Pre-Socratics. I will forego discussing them in more detail and just flatly state that they are all wrong. Even the answer of the atomists was no more than a lucky guess and has very little to do with the atomic theory of 19th century physics. If you are confused by this distinction between physics and metaphysics, please ask in the comment section. For now, we can simply view the Pre-Socratics as transition figures. But there are 3 good reasons to at least know about them. First, several ideas of the Pre-Socratics were picked up and developed by later philosophers, so it will be helpful for us to at least know where these ideas came from. Second, to illustrate how the Pre-Socratics were completely stuck on the subject of metaphysics. Third, to indicate how widespread confusion and disagreement among philosophers always brings about a new wave of skepticism and subjectivism. In the 5th century BC, these skeptics were known as the Sophists. Confronted with all the different and contradictory views provided by the Pre-Socratics, the Sophists didn't know how to decide who was right. Here are all these learned men presenting a host of what seemed to be plausible views, and yet they all end up disagreeing with one another. Doesn't this show, said the Sophists, that there is no right answer, and that every man can only arrive at what is true for him? This subjectivist conclusion has been immortalized by the most influential of the Sophists, Protagoras. Quote, "Man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, of the things that are not, that they are not." Unquote. Or putting it in metaphysical terms, everything is subjective. And as I indicated last time, this skeptic approach to philosophy always ends up in a self-refuting dead end. In spite of this, the Sophists had a profound influence on the politics of their day. What kind of influence? Well, if everything is subjective, then there is no objective principle men can appeal to in case of a dispute. How then should you treat people, bereft of a rational basis for dealing with them? Brute physical force. In the words of another sophist, Thrasymachus, quote, "Justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger." Unquote. Fortunately, there was a contemporary of the Sophists who knew that the Sophists were wrong, and that man was Socrates. Socrates understood that objective knowledge of reality is possible, but in order to discover it, we have to ask one more fundamental question in philosophy, namely, how do I know? In other words, how does knowledge come about, and how can it be validated? By asking these sorts of questions, Socrates inaugurated the science of epistemology, which is the second fundamental branch of philosophy. Socrates held that if we can find out how knowledge is acquired, what does and does not qualify as knowledge, then we have a way of settling the disagreements among philosophers and escape the subjectivism of the sophists. And in pursuit of this task, Socrates made another crucial discovery. He realized that the question of human knowledge is intimately tied to the role and nature of concepts, which are traditionally referred to as universals. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this topic, let me elaborate for a few minutes. Among living organisms, we can distinguish three different levels of awareness: sensory, perceptual, and conceptual. The sensory level of awareness is the crudest and consists of blind reaction towards external stimuli, such as pressure, warmth, or light. All plants and many lower animals operate on this sensory level. The perceptual level of awareness includes the capacities of the sensory level, but also enables an organism to detect and distinguish specific entities. All mammals and other higher animals have this capacity. At this stage, an organism is capable of conscious awareness, self-generated action, and of experiencing pleasure or pain. The conceptual level of awareness includes all capacities of the sensory and perceptual levels, but is also able to integrate perceptual information into concepts. And it is only human beings who have this capacity. Take a pet dog, for example, who is limited to the perceptual level of awareness. As such, he can know this tree in your garden, this tree on the other side of the road, and this tree in the park. However, the dog does not know the concept tree. In his mind, there is this tall thing over here, and this tall thing over there, and this other tall thing over there. But he is not capable to put all three of these things side by side in his mind, compare their similarities and differences in order to form the concept tree. And the same is true for his awareness of all entities. So your dog can know you, but he does not know what a man is. He can know this fun and tasty thing over there, but he does not know what a bone is. Or to put it in general terms, on the perceptual level, an animal can only know something particular, but not something in general. It can only know percepts, but not concepts. We humans, on the other hand, have this capacity to form concepts. We can take separate particular entities, compare them to see if they share any fundamental attributes, and then file all of them under a single concept, like tree. We can also go on and use basic concepts like tree to form higher and more abstract concepts, such as plant, living organism, or photosynthesis. And the first man to grasp the crucial importance of concepts in understanding and validating human knowledge was Socrates. What he didn't know was how concepts are formed and validated. For example, on the concept of justice, the sophists were fond of arguing, he may be a just man for you, but he isn't just for me. Socrates, on the other hand, knew there had to be an objective basis in reality for the concept justice. He just wanted to find out what it was, how to define justice. That's why he spent so much time engaging his fellow Athenians in conversation, trying to find out what is justice. Unfortunately, the majority of Athenians were not very comfortable about all these epistemological questions Socrates kept asking. But they did not know what to do about it, except having a democratic vote to have him killed. So with the death of Socrates, the task of finding answers to the questions of epistemology and concept formation fell to the next generation of philosophers. But not only that. Thanks to the combined achievements of Thales and Socrates, the ground was now prepared for philosophers to develop complete systems of philosophy. The first of these philosophic system builders was Plato. Unlike the Pre-Socratics, Plato did not just provide an isolated view on metaphysics, but combined it with an epistemology, a theory of knowledge. This combination led him to an unavoidable series of conclusions for the central question of philosophy. What should I do? That's ethics. And its derivative question. What should we do? And that's politics. So next week we will take a look at this philosophic system of Plato's and then contrast it with the philosophy of his student, Aristotle. Once we've done that, we can start reaping some of the rewards for our efforts, because we will have the necessary tools to understand how these philosophic systems are at work in our lives today. So I hope you bear with me as we continue this lightning-like survey of ancient philosophy. Until next time, thank you for your kind attention.